Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Spitters Conference. My name is Molly Cook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be helping out with technology on today's webinar. Today, we'll be talking about the Job Training and Economic Development Grant Program. If you have questions as this webinar proceeds, please post those in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the webinar. A reminder that this webinar will be recorded. The presentation, recording, and any materials presented during today's meeting will be available on Illinois WorkNet following today. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning, and the recorded session will also encompass closed captioning. A reminder that if you have any internet connection issues or would prefer to call in, you can do so by calling into the webinar using the phone number that was in your registration email. I also posted in the chat box a few minutes ago that we'd love for you to introduce yourself and your organization or agency, so please feel free to do that in the chat. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Lisa Jones.
Thanks, Molly, and I just want to welcome everyone today. This is an awesome turnout. Today, we're going to be talking about the Job Training and Economic Development Grant Program, and I know many of you have been around long enough to know that this program was a great program years ago, and we are happy that we are able to relaunch the program, specifically with our ARPA funds, the Recovery Program funds. So Molly, if you could go to the next slide. And I am Lisa Jones, Office of Employment and Training. I am responsible at the Office of Employment and Training for policy, legislation, and then oversee special initiatives and education initiatives. So and I will be joined, by the way, by two of my colleagues. Tanika Chisholm will be doing an overview of our GATA requirements, and then Natasha Telger from Illinois WorkNet will be providing a brief overview of the project management system that we'll be using for the grant. So, and as you see by the agenda, I laid out actually what each of my colleagues will be talking about. So if you could please go to the next slide, Molly, I'd appreciate it. I want to give you just a brief little background on how we got to where we are today. So as you know, in the General Assembly appropriated $50 million in workforce recovery dollars to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. And specifically, the funding is to target low-income communities. It is for disproportionately impacted communities, emphasis on businesses impacted by COVID, and then certainly individuals that have been impacted by COVID as well. These grants, the period of performance for these grants will end on December 31st of 2024. We can award funds through December 31st, 2024, but they must all be expended by December 31st, 2026. So as we were thinking about how we were going to release the funds, thinking about what the capacity was and what we had been doing in the past and where we were in our workforce programs now, we thought the JTED program fit the bill very well for the pieces of the recovery information or program that we were supposed to implement. And just a quick reminder that JTED was founded in 1997, and it was to foster local economic development. It was also to link businesses with low-skilled workers and actually focus training on individuals that were from marginalized communities or had significant barriers to employment. If you could go to the next slide, Molly, that would be great. I kind of talked about this a little bit just a few minutes ago. The JTED program was updated. Certainly, we did have to make some changes that you'll notice for those of you that are familiar with the old JTED program, and that was primarily to meet the requirements of the recovery funds. But we still made sure that the focus was on businesses and individual needs. There is a total of $40 million that will be released through funding opportunities. $20 million is what we are releasing today. We're looking hopefully to serve between 12 and 1,500 people. And then I know this is a pretty broad range, but as you'll see when we get into the nuts and bolts of the grant with the barrier reduction funding that we're going to talk about in a little bit, we wanted to make sure that there was leeway, to address those emergency needs of our customers, and then also realizing that apprenticeship can be one of the training programs that you want to implement in your area, and those usually cost a little bit more. So next slide, please. So eligible entities, I think, one thing to point out here that's very different is the expansion of who can actually apply for this. We have, in addition to the not-for-profits that have applied in the past, we also are including private, public or private educational institutions, industry associations, and employers. We also specifically wanted to point out, since Title I, the WIOA program, and the one-stop centers are under the Office of Employment and Training at DCEO, we wanted to make sure that this was an opportunity that they could access, as well as community action agencies. We did actually had a question already that will be in the FAQs around employers. So we wanted to have a specific definition for employers. And for the purposes of eligible entities, employers, in relation to the definition of eligible entities, means a person or company that is registered with the appropriate governmental entities to do business in Illinois and that employs one or more individuals. So that's a distinction. And then for just working with your employers, it's a company that is registered with appropriate governmental entities to do business in any state that is adjacent to Illinois, unless otherwise set forth in the NOFO. And we wanted to make sure that that was a clear distinction, so that those of you that are on bordering states and have partnerships with those businesses could continue those partnerships. Next slide, please. The target industries, again, because this is the American Recovery Act funding, we wanted to target in this particular opportunity the industries that were most impacted, and really interested in addressing labor shortages. So in addition to those industries that are most impacted, we also included information technology, transportation, and construction trades. Also realizing the impact that COVID has had on our small businesses, we are really wanting and encouraging small businesses to apply as well. Next slide. Thanks, Amali. Target populations, we had to be specific because of the ARPA guidance on who we could serve through this funding. And so we are looking at unemployed. So, and as you can see, it's, the traditional definition, which is without a job and wants and is available to work, looking at underemployed. And here we did add to this definition anyone that has a negative economic or public health impact experienced by COVID. And then underrepresented is persons that receive or live in qualified census tracts or disproportionately impacted areas and who've experienced those results from COVID-19. And then also we have youth included in underrepresented that have one or more barriers to employment. Next slide, please.
I don't know if you want to go over this now or later, but someone asked if you could go over the employer definition one more time.
Oh, yes, I absolutely will. Absolutely. So the employer definition, and it will be in the Q&A also. Employers, in relation to the definition of eligible entities, means a person or company that is registered with the appropriate governmental entity to do business in Illinois and that employs one or more individuals. In relation to all other purposes for businesses, means a person or company that is registered with the appropriate governmental entity to do business in any state that is adjacent to Illinois, unless otherwise set forth in the NOFO, and that employs one or more individuals. So I guess just to give a quick example, if I'm a business that wants to apply for the grant, I have to be registered to do business in Illinois. If I am a community-based organization that wants to work with a company that's based in St. Louis, that's perfectly acceptable as part of your grant application when you are talking about your partnerships with employers. So thanks, Molly, for pointing that out.
Yeah, yep. And it seems like just a clarification someone had based on that is that if you are not in one of those industries listed, then do you not qualify?
You can ask for an exception. You can, and certainly if you're a small business, that those industries do not apply. You can make, again, just contact us because we will consider industries outside of the ones that we've listed. However, those are our priority industries. Okay, target communities. So again, ARPA requires that we look at areas with in a qualified census tract or in disproportionately impacted areas. We've used the US Census Bureau and the HUD definitions for qualified census tract in disproportionately impacted areas. There is a map on Illinois WorkNet, and we have in the PowerPoint and actually in the NOFO, in the funding opportunity language, the link to that map, and you put in an address and it will tell you if it's in a qualified census tract or in a disproportionately impacted area. So that would be available to you. Next slide. The program categories. So again, here's another difference from the original JTED program. We've kept the, as I mentioned, the job seeker and employment focus, but we did add a youth focus. So looking at, offering career development opportunities and work-based learning. And then the other category that we're really excited about to be offering is the barrier reduction funding. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more, but just wanted to give you a high level overview of what the categories are. So next slide, please. So here's kind of going to get into what we're thinking about for the delivery of services for the populations that you might choose to serve. So, looking at outreach and recruitment within your application, employer engagement, basically the basic services that we currently provide, but training, supportive services, of course, barrier reduction, placement, and follow-up. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those right now. So if you can do next slide. For outreach and recruitment, some things that we'll be looking for is, how are you going to disseminate your program information? Are you going to do flyers? Will you be holding events to recruit employers, or, be going to schools or other organizations to, recruit youth, if that's one of your target populations? Would be some things that we'll be looking at around outreach and recruitment. For employer engagement, are you going to be surveying your business community to, to establish or to increase your business employer partnerships? Will you work with economic development agencies? How are you going to leverage your connections with your local boards, industry associations, or chambers of commerce? Are some things, just some key highlights of what we'll be looking for employer engagement. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Molly. Career planning, we are looking at, assessment and employment plans, making sure that in your service delivery model that you're doing interest and skills in inventory. Essential employability skills are definitely, should very much be a focus of what you're doing, as well as digital and financial literacy are things that we're really looking for. How are you going to address, the barriers to employment and suitability for the desired training program? Is this a good match for the customers? Is based on your assessment, and after talking to the customer, is what they're interested in training and what you're training for a good fit for them? And then, of course, the career and employment plan is really just a living document. I know many of you already have been doing these for years, so I don't want to dive into it too much, but certainly, based on the goals and objectives and the services needed, you would wrap those all into the employment plan. Sorry about that. So if you could go to the next slide. Okay. Training. So on our training services, looking at occupational skills training that prepares for careers that are traditionally non-academic, skill upgrade and retraining, to assist with upgrading skills that are needed for businesses. If they're, courses that provide an occupational training to prepare persons for entrance into a new occupation. Sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied. Entrepreneurial training is also something that you can consider as part of your program plan. And certainly, job readiness training and adult education and literacy. Work-based learning, if you could go to the next slide, the standard work-based learning, pre-apprenticeship, certainly looking at pre-apprenticeship opportunities as well as apprenticeship opportunities. Work experience or internships, so that folks can have structured learning experiences that take place on the work, take place on site at the employer. Transitional jobs is also another training model that we are really interested in funding and following along with, because that was a big thing, I think, under JTED. For us in the WIOA world, though, that's not something that we traditionally do. So I think for those of us that have a feet in both worlds right now, interested in best practices and program design for transitional jobs, which if those of you that may not know, transitional jobs do subsidize up to 100% of the wage for that person that's on the job. Then our on-the-job training, they can, assist employers who want to expand their business or who need additional staff and trained in specialized skills. For purposes of this grant, we are allowing up to 75% reimbursement of the wage rate. Customized training, also one that we're interested in if that fits within your program design. And then incumbent worker training also. Might be important to mention that incumbent worker training really is only allowed under category 2. That's where it fits the best. We are looking at employers with 200 or 250 or less employees, and that the trainees meet the definition of underemployed. Also, if, as part of layoff aversion, if they've received a notice of termination or layoff. And by getting additional training, they can stay on the job. Next slide, please.
Lisa, there's a question in the chat to clarify what a transitional job is.
Yeah, sure. Transitional jobs training is, excuse me. Transitional jobs training is a time-limited wage-paid work experience that's subsidized up to 100%. You can use public, private, or nonprofit sectors. It's really for those folks that have limited work experience. So it serves as an entry into gaining work experience. The program provider generally acts as the employer, and it's really focusing on developing workplace skills. I'm going to go through 2 more slides, and then we're going to take just a little short break. Just a couple of minutes, and then we'll jump right back into the program. Supportive services and barrier reduction. So for this NOFO, we were trying to draw a distinction between supportive services and barrier reduction because there's of course overlap given some of the things that you would fund. So what we're thinking about and looking for in applications is when you're putting together your budget and thinking about supportive services, think about that in terms of training. So anything that a participant would need to advance or to support their coursework. So, transportation, we can do childcare, testing, uniforms, books, those kinds of things. And then barrier reduction funding, we're looking at the larger things that are more like emergency costs, things that wouldn't necessarily be related to an occupational training program. So things like, paying a month's rent, mental health services if those are needed. Digital technology needs also would be in there. Utilities if that's necessary, or paying a phone bill, or car repairs would be some things to consider for funding for barrier reduction. And then finally, placement and follow-up. There's not really a big need to go over these. I'm sure that all of us on here know placement really is about how do we help these individuals be successful so that they're placed in employment. We are encouraging follow-up, but we're not requiring follow-up. So, certainly we'd like to see how you anticipate doing follow-up if you are. And follow-up activities, of course, can include mentoring, continuing supportive services for a certain length of time, providing information, counsel, additional career counseling, and then, any kind of job search that you would also want to do or continue to do as part of follow-up for those that might be leaving just a training program but haven't been employed yet. So I'm going to take just a break for a couple of minutes for those of you that may need a bio break or just catch a breath, since I have been talking rather quickly. So we will be back at 8:55. Okay, it's 8:55, so if we want to get started back, we do have a lot to get through and just a couple hours left. So Molly had said there were some questions in the chat, so I want to take 2 or 3 of those before we move on in the presentation. So Molly, if you could read those off, that would be great.
Great. So for what is being presented / scope of work, does the applicant have to provide all 9 scopes, or can we select which is most appropriate for our program model?
You can select what's most appropriate for your program model, but we're definitely going to want to see how you determined the placement into the training program.
Okay. The next question is, do youth-focused programs have to culminate in an industry-recognized credential? And is there an example of an industry-recognized credential?
Yes, we do want youth to come out with an industry recognized credential. That could be something, well, you know what, I'm going to walk that back. They don't have to have an industry recognized credential, but they do need a credential. So, you know, you could do high school, you could come out, you know, with some additional you know, math, remediation, credentials from that. If they do come out with an industry recognized credential, I think, you know, one of the things could be Microsoft Office. We do have a program going right now that has a business industry focus in another one of my programs that I oversee. And so, and one of the credentials that the youth are going to come out with is being, you know, having the Microsoft Office certifications. I should have got a drink during that 5 minutes. Okay, next question.
Do we have to serve targeted populations that are in targeted communities, or can it be one or the other?
It can be one or the other.
Perfect. Do you want one more?
Sure.
Okay. Can you explain what you mean by we are looking at employers with fewer than 250 employees? Does that preference apply to applicants in all 4 categories?
No, it does not. No, it does not.
Okay. Let's see here. Can organizations apply to more than one category with a single application?
Yes, absolutely.
There was a question. Go ahead, Lisa, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, these are like simple yes, nos.
I know, going right through them. Can we get a list of organizations attending the Bidders Conference?
Let us check on that. Let us check on that. I don't know why we can't, but I don't want to say yes for sure. So we'll certainly check in and post it on, if we can, we'll post it on our Illinois WorkNet funding page.
Do you want a few more?
No, let's go ahead and go through some, and then we'll have another stopping point where we can take a few more questions.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so performance measures. So for our performance, we have established these goals, looking at goals for each training program. How many are enrolled in the program? How many are going to be completing the program? Which ones are obtaining a credential? You know, which ones are put in post-secondary ed? You know, how many went in unsubsidized employment? And then what our expectation is that acceptable performance would be anything above 75% of your planned goal. Oh, sorry, Molly, can you switch the slide? I just now noticed that we're not on the performance slide. Sorry about that.
Sorry, yes, I just
No,
noticed
okay.
that, so it's one forward.
Oh, don't worry.
Sorry.
And then, so from those goals, then we're going to have specific metrics that we will be looking at and that will be recorded in the Illinois WorkNet system that Natasha is going to talk about in just a second. But, you know, for there, we're going to be tracking the number of businesses you have engaged, you know, and I mentioned this already, but certainly the number of individuals placed and acquiring industry credentials, any kind of certification or license. We're also going to be tracking separately apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship. how many are completing OJTs. So those are the types of actual metrics that we will be tracking. So with that, that is a good place for me to kick it over to my colleague Natasha Telger from Illinois WorkNet, and she's going to just briefly talk about the Illinois WorkNet system. So Natasha.
Hey, thank you. So Illinois WorkNet offers program implementation and facilitation tools for providers that are working with both, participants and employers. We'll be using the IWIS system, Illinois Workforce Integration System. And again, it's within Illinois WorkNet, the Illinois WorkNet platform. And these tools allow providers to, customize their case management tools by entering their grant information and program information. And those tools are used to, or that information is used to populate other places within the system, and also is used towards reporting. So we have intake tools. So the intake would be an initial assessment that collects information related to eligibility, but then also information that can be used for suitability as well. We have the eligibility component and a place where you'll identify those that are enrolled in your program. And again, like the case management tools for developing a career and service plan, which identifies providers. You can track their activity, their service status, document activity and service related costs, and also document outcomes. We have referral tools. We also have communication tools, which are, we have case notes that can be used to communicate between the staff, but then, document updates on the participant, but then also can be used to send messages and emails to the participant as well. We have attendance tracking option, if that's something that you'd like to use. Then we also have tools for the participant. So they could access, their information through their participant dashboard. We'll have, we have dashboards, and we'll have various reports that you'll need to use for implementing the project. And then of course, success stories. So those will be documented in the system as well. And all this information that is populated, within the IWIS system will be used again for reports. We can use the information to populate various apps in the tools. And all this information is, what you'll need to have is an Illinois WorkNet account. If you have an existing Illinois WorkNet account, then we can provide you access to these tools. If not, we'll work with you in order to get that set up and to give you access. And also there will be additional training that will go into the various phases and steps along the way. And then we'll also have technical assistance sessions so that as you're entering the information into the system, we'll have time set aside. So if you have any questions, we can address those as a group, because if you have a question, somebody else probably does too. So any questions? We just want to provide just a high level overview of some of the tools that are available in the system.
So Natasha, I see a question. It says, for this grant, will the IWNS system process and request be different than typical?
Say it again. Will the
for this grant, will the Illinois WorkNet system process and requests be different than typical?
I would have to understand what typical means. I don't know, with referencing to using Illinois WorkNet in the past. So are you talking about requesting a partner account?
I'll wait and see if that if that person posts a follow-up question in the chat.
So let me just put it this way. Whenever the grants are awarded, then we can reach out to those grantees and get a list of the individuals that need to have access to the system. And if you're already in Illinois WorkNet, then we can either make you a partner and give you access to the tools, or we can work with you to help your staff get access to the appropriate tools. And there would be training on that.
And then a clarifying question, it looks like this is the only other question I see right now that we haven't answered is, would awardees required to use Illinois WorkNet to implement and track the program? Clarifying.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Natasha.
Perfect.
I see that the question is pre or post award. I'm not really sure I'm following pre-award, but definitely post award. If you're funded, this is the platform that we will use. As Natasha pointed out, all the various pieces of the system.
Yep. And I see a question that came in currently using for YCP, and I'm assuming that apprenticeship expansion program is JTED unique. And so what you'll notice as you work more and more with Illinois WorkNet is that we're able to customize the tools for the program. So while many of the tools will be very familiar to what you've used with YCP and Apprenticeship Illinois, what we try to do, because it makes it quicker to be able to release the tools as well, is that we use those modules. So it'll be similar to what you've done, but there would be customization that is specific to this particular program. Yes, the question was, didn't hear the answer to the system required for, oh, wait a minute, apologies, didn't hear the answers. Is the system required for application or post-grant award? Yes. If this is the tool that you'll be using to enter the, I'm not understanding the question, I guess.
The IWIS system is required for post application. So once you're awarded the grant, you will have to use IWIS. I'm not really sure I'm clear on what's meant by pre-application. If what you're asking is, do we have to already use WorkNet? No, because there'll be training. If not, if I'm, and we can certainly, take this question offline to understand it a little bit more if it's needed. Yes, you do need to be, no, I'm sorry, I see what you're saying now. Sorry, Leslie. Do we need to be logged into the system as part of the application for the grant? No, you do not. The grants are actually submitted through the grants, through the e-grants system, I think. I'm going to have Tamika will talk about that a little bit, about the submission process, but there is a specific link that you will have to upload your application and attachments to. And the link is in the notice of funding opportunity of where you will have to submit the application to. Sorry that it took us so long to understand what you were asking. I apologize for that. If there are no other questions for Natasha, thanks, Natasha. We appreciate you giving us that brief update, and we will move on into getting into some of the application components. There are basically 5 components, or I guess if I did my math correctly, 6 components to the application process. The first one is application organization capacity. Just want to give you a few pointers on what we would be looking for. providing evidence that you can partner with employers in these targeted industries, and serving the target population. What kind of experience do you have with that? What kind of experience, and can you demonstrate that you have ran successful training programs and partnerships with key stakeholders? What are some examples of current or completed projects that would be similar in the scope? And then we're interested also in the expertise of your staff, of who will be specifically the point person or doing the case management / career planning for the participants that you'll be serving. So next slide, please. Oh, go one more. Sorry, thanks. Documentation of need. So, and I think, of course, application, applicant capacity and documentation are pretty standard, right, in most funding opportunities. So, looking at how did you use LMI, labor market information, to determine your employer needs? We want to see a brief analysis of that. How, did you use local and regional labor market information, to identify which employers you're going to be working with, as well as what industries you're going to target and what occupations. Also, how did you use data to determine what populations you're going to serve? Do you have a high unemployment rate in the particular area that you're going to target for services? So, looking at that, do you have, if you're looking at particularly individuals with, one or more barriers to employment, is there a specific subset of that population that you need to address? For example, probably not the best example right now, but for some reason it's one that popped in my head, is homelessness. If you want to advance to the next slide. Also, just before I get into the next slide, just want to let you know that you can, pull some of this information from, BLS.gov, census.gov. The Illinois report card has some data to help you with the determination of those needs if you need it. Our program categories 1, 2, and 3. As I mentioned earlier, applicants can include one or more of the program design categories in one application. You will need to provide the strategies that you're going to use to recruit your businesses and your industries. What role are each going to play, and what role did employers play in selecting the training and occupations that you're proposing in your application? Again, I've talked about this, touched on this a little bit, but what are your outreach strategies? What's enrollment look like for the individuals in your target population? And then also for each of these, we are asking for what your career planning approach is, which ties back to assessment, including things like essential employability skills, financial and digital literacy, wanting to know what training providers are you going to be working with, and then what are the work-based learning opportunities that you'll be including in your service delivery approach. Next slide, please. Category 4, barrier reduction. As I mentioned, this is certainly something that we are very excited to be able to offer. One of the things that we're specifically going to be interested in is how we use that funding, and the outcomes for that funding, and how it really has helped our participants be more successful in addressing their needs. So for the funding, you can access barrier reduction funding in a couple of ways. One, you can include it with your application as part of one of the categories that you're proposing. So it can be part of the job seeker focus, it can be part of the employer focus, it can be part of the youth focus. Or if you have a training program, you can request standalone funding for barrier reduction. So and I talked a little bit about the difference between support services and barrier reduction. One of the things that you are going to have to do is develop a policy. So we are going to want to see a policy for barrier reduction. We're also going to want to see included in your application your policy for supportive service. But we definitely want to see this whole barrier reduction funding, what's your policy around how you're going to use barrier reduction funding. Are you going to, for example, are you actually going to provide cash assistance? If you are, is there going to be a limit to that cash assistance? So maybe you're going to set, if somebody needs cash assistance for something in particular, you're going to say it's $200 is going to be our cap. There is a sample on Illinois WorkNet. It's one of the appendixes to the application that is a sample barrier reduction policy. So certainly you can use that as a guide. You're going to have, if you're doing standalone, one of the things is you're going to have to identify what funding sources are going to support training. So you're really going to have to demonstrate how you're going to leverage the barrier reduction funding against your current training programs, your work-based learning or other career services. The program participants are going to have to reside or receive these services within the qualified census tract or disproportionately impacted area. Also looking at demonstrating that these are individuals that you're serving in your program that have had experienced some negative economic or health impact as a result of COVID. And then looking at a total, what's the total cost of participant, what's the need for the funds, and the types of assistance that you're going to be asking for. And these are all for specifically for the standalone barrier reduction funding. Next slide. Program implementation and performance goals. We have a couple of templates that are available for that need completed as part of the application. The program implementation plan includes major activities, the timeline for completing those activities, specified by the number of months, who's going to be the responsible staff, what's the deliverable. There's also a table for performance goals. So you're going to indicate each of your training programs and what the planned goals are. What's enrolled in training, what's completed training, how many are going to be enrolled in post-secondary, how many would be retained for 6 months. Also on the standards, looking at, since we've set the standard at 75%, how is that going to look for your grant? And then the additional metrics that we talked about a little bit, how those will be evaluated for effectiveness of employment and training services. And then last slide, that's a perfect segue into Tamika going over GATA and other budget requirements. What's the cost effectiveness? We want to see that. What's the return on investment? How do you plan once the grant ends to continue sustaining this program? So certainly looking at, your budget narrative is going to be very important. The budget narrative should really include an analysis of the cost efficiency in relationship to the planned outcomes. It must provide a high-level narrative, including an analysis, and I just mentioned this, the analysis of the cost efficiency, a detailed narrative of each line item cost and how they correlate with the narrative in the budget template. And then if you are leveraging any funds or matching or getting matching funds, please, those need to be also included in the budget. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, how this project will be sustained. I'm going to stop for a minute, take a few questions, and then I'm going to kick it over to Tamika.
Great. So one of the questions that we have here is, if we already get funding for pre-employment services through DHS, could we still get funding to utilize this as a pre/post-employment training and placement for the students we use in our current programs?
Yes, you can certainly leverage. You can request funds through this program and demonstrate how you're leveraging these funds with your DHS funds.
Great. And then someone asked for clarification. Did you say if youth applicants are required to be out of school?
They are. It's 16 to 24, so it could be in school or out of school.
Okay. And is there a match requirement?
There is not a match requirement, no.
Do participants need to reside in a QCT/DIA, or do the businesses/services need to be located in the QCT/DIA?
The participants either need to reside or receive services in either a QCT or a DIA.
Does DCEO have targets or bands for those efficiency targets?
I'm sorry, repeat that question.
Does DCEO have targets or bands for the efficiency targets?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think the answer is the 75%.
Okay. And will there be further guidance on how to execute barrier reduction? For example, a client needs a car repair, they can't afford it, so we therefore can't reimburse them. Do we issue a payment directly to an auto shop?
Yes, you can issue the payment directly to the auto shop in that example, yes.
See here. Are applicants that include deliverables in more than one category seen as more positive applicants? Or is it more about quality within one category versus wide breadth of services?
Oh, that's a good question. But would you repeat it again?
Sure. Are
Mm.
applicants that include deliverables in more than one category seen as more positive applicants? Or is it more about quality within one category versus wide breadth of services?
I think it's just about quality in general, honestly. I don't, I think it's all how you demonstrate your capacity. If you are asking for, more than one category, certainly that's what we would want to see you demonstrate, is that you have the capacity to do more than one category. So it's certainly not, you're not going to be weighted more within the merit review process for only doing one category, and and vice versa, you wouldn't be penalized for doing more than one category.
Okay. You mentioned wages are reimbursable at 75%. Can you clarify what is meant? Does that mean if a participant earns 10,000, we can request up to 7,500?
You can reimburse wages only to the employer up to 75% of the wages. So the reimbursement would be to the employer for that percentage of the wage.
Do you want me to keep going with some questions?
Let's take because we've got some time. We're actually kind of blowing right through this. Yeah, we can take a few more.
Okay. Can participants be paid a stipend to attend?
Yes, we do allow for stipends.
Okay. Confirming that existing programs are eligible for this opportunity.
You would have to demonstrate how you're going to leverage this funding to expand or improve that program.
Would adherence to the DOTL sufficiently cover documentation of need?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Would adherence to the DOTL sufficiently cover documentation of need?
I know you have to demonstrate how you came up with your industry and occupations.
Can entities propose to work in more than one industry? To whom and under what conditions does the 250 employee cap apply?
I'm telling you, these questions are getting hard for me. These are really good questions. Just go ahead and repeat that, because I'm.
Sure, I'll break it into two questions.
Yeah, do that.
Can entities propose to work in more than one industry?
Yes.
Okay. And to whom and under what conditions does the 250 employee cap apply?
We haven't really set any caps or really any requirements around that 250. It's just a a ballpark of something that we're looking at, but there is no specific requirements under that, other than that would be employers that we would be interested in working with.
Can we co-enroll into WIOA and blend funding when applicable?
Absolutely.
Are centers for independent living eligible to apply?
Yes, if they fit one of the categories, and it would seem to me they would fit the not-for-profit, the community-based organization.
Okay. Let's see here. So someone asked, where will we be sharing this recording? And I can put a link into WorkNet in a few minutes. Does paying participants a stipend to attend fall under barrier reduction?
I think it can. I mean, let's ask Tamika that question.
Okay. Should we ask her that in the next part of her presentation?
Well, if she wants to jump in now, we would love for her to jump in now, or we can save it as part of her presentation.
Okay.
I have to put you on the spot, Tamika.
Molly, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. It's, does paying participants a stipend to attend fall under barrier reduction?
I believe that it can. I think it would just be how the scope of when the applicant writes their narrative for barrier reduction and how they incorporate it in the total work plan that's proposed under that item. But I believe in that context, it can. But we would have to look at the full narrative to make that distinction. But just within that context, yes, it would qualify as a barrier reduction under that qualification, that criteria, sorry.
And a similar question, Tamika, can barrier reduction funding be used for scholarships for higher ed or trade education?
Again, yes, in that context, that can qualify as a barrier reduction. Yes.
Okay, let's, I got a private message that said I missed a couple of slides, so I'm so sorry about that. So we want to just take a pause, and I'll speed through my other 2 or 3 slides, and then we will kick it over to Tamika. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Molly. So we are requiring training program summaries for each training program that you're proposing in your application. That includes the category, what's the name of the training program, excuse me, what industry you're going to serve, what are the goals, a summary of how that training program meets the needs of the industry. Are there, what types of training materials are there? What's the method of the training? Is it, virtual training? Is it in classroom? Who's going to provide that training? What's the duration of the training? What are going to be the credentials or certificates earned? What's the expected outcome? Who are the partnerships with for your training program? And then, of course, here, and we answered this saying yes, that you can have more than one training program. You need to then do a summary for each program. So, we're not limiting it to 1 or 2 programs. We can, certainly, you can have 3 to 5 programs, whatever your application is, or whatever works for your particular area. But again, just knowing that definitely you'll have to demonstrate the capacity to be able to oversee and implement that many, and I don't want to say that many like it's a lot, but certainly demonstrate you have the capacity to have those additional training programs. So next slide. Just want to quickly go over all of the documents that you will need to submit on the DCEO, or it's called Smart Sheet actually. The link that you'll use to upload your application and any attachments. So there is the DCEO uniform grant application. There are a couple of disclosures that you also must submit. Of course, the program application. Just want to mention that we updated yesterday. The program application is a fillable form. It is available as a PDF. We also yesterday included a Word version that's fillable. So if some reason you are having an issue opening the PDF, then you can use the Word version. I will also suggest a little tip if you're having trouble because you're using Google or Chrome or Safari. If you would use Internet Explorer, it will open in Internet Explorer. So that was a little thing I learned yesterday as well. So the training program summaries that we just went over, looking at equity and employment, and how does your program model address equity in your service area? The barrier reduction funding policy, supportive service policy, resumes, the memorandum of understanding, and then the uniform grant budget template, which those are all pretty standard for application submission. So next slide, just real briefly, here's the breakout of the review criteria. Applicant capacities 20%, documentation of needs 30%, quality of the program plan is the biggest number where the biggest weight of the application will be focused on, and then 10% on the budget narrative. Also, as part of the application package, and it's one of the appendix, I believe, we do have a scoring rubric. So you will be able to see exactly what we are looking for from that rubric. So next slide, Molly. Application due date is October 29th. And then we do have a link on this slide deck that directs you to Illinois WorkNet and the landing page for the JTED program. And with that, if we want to take just a couple of more questions before we kick it off to Mika, I'm happy to do that. Molly?
Sure. So let's see here. May our organization act as a training provider under the program if our IBHE application is under review?
You know what? Let me get an answer on that. I don't want to say yes or no. I think the answer is going to be no, but I want to take that internal, and we'll post that on the FAQ.
Okay. And then I also want to note that Sarah Blaylock posted a link to where this recording will be in the chat. So look for her message.
Thanks, Sarah.
Does the length of the training have a limit?
No.
Okay. For the youth category, do we have to match participants only within target industries? And can you please review what those industries are?
No, we would prefer it, but no, for youth, you would not have to. But I would suggest that I think we have a really pretty good coverage of industries, the target industries that we have as part of the application. But I would also recommend that you use our DCEO 5-year economic plan to see what are the target industries in the state. And then just as a reminder of the target industries, those are IT, construction trades, PDL, as well as those industries that have been most severely impacted by COVID, which are manufacturing, healthcare, and social assistance, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation and food service, waste management, and retail trade.
Great. Can a request for standalone barrier reduction be used to support another DCEO grant?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any guidelines around the amount to pay for stipends?
We don't have that in the NOFO, but there are some requirements for stipends that we will address in another technical assistance session. And it has to do with determining, it has something to do with the employer, but it's totally escaping me right now, but we will definitely get an answer and address that in the FAQ.
Okay. Can we use funding to leverage grants funded by the City of Chicago? Program participants would be enrolled in 2 grants.
I'm going to let Tamika answer that one. Did we lose Tamika?
Nope, I'm here. Sorry, I was on mute.
No, no
If you're leveraging funds from a different program or grant, and that targeted population will be included in your JTED, we just need a narrative on the funds that you are leveraging. But yes, you will have participants that are duly enrolled because they qualify for both. But we also just have to ensure that the funding sources that you're using to leverage, when you look at your budget template, I believe section B is the summary of leveraging funds. There are some criteria that are outlined in that section just to ensure that the funds you are leveraging from a different program or funding source, that those will be allowable for this grant. So take a look at the budget template and look at section B, and that will kind of walk you through if the funds that you're thinking of using to leverage with this grant, if that would be acceptable.
Okay, great. Can we enroll residents from other states such as Indiana?
That's a good question. We will have to get back to you on that one. Unless Tamika, you would know the answer to that. But
I do not know the answer to that one. We will have to post that one in a FAQ link.
Okay. To clarify, you can apply for operations within just one of the 9 program areas, so long as you have connections to the others.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. It was a clarification question. You can apply for operations within just one of the 9 program areas, so long as you have connections to the others.
Yes.
Okay.
That sounds like yes.
Is providing a gas card rather than a transportation reimbursement model allowable?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
Sure. Is providing a gas card rather than a transportation reimbursement model allowable?
Yeah, yes. Is that right, Tamika? I'm sure they can. If they can pay for gas, they can do gas cards.
Yes, gas cards are acceptable.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
If we are the employer of record, can we receive reimbursement of wages?
That's a Tamika question.
I will have to clarify and get clarification on that question. I don't want to misspeak on that answer, but we'll post that one as well.
Okay.
That's a good question.
Here's another clarifying question. Eligible participants must be part of the targeted population and must reside or receive services in a target community.
I'm sorry, say that again.
It was a clarifying question. Eligible participants must be part of the targeted population and must reside or receive services in a target community.
Yes. Hold on. I want to look at the question. For some reason, my mind is like going blank. Say that again one more time, Molly. I am so sorry.
No worries. I'm going to scroll up to it.
Okay.
You know what? I'm going to copy and paste it to you in the chat so then you can also see it.
Perfect.
Okay.
For some reason, I'm getting brain fog right now.
Sometimes it helps me too if I can see something as well as hear it. So I just sent it to you.
Okay, so it's question regarding wages of, if we are the employer of record, that's the one that came to me. I think you posted the wrong question.
Oh no, I did.
Sorry, folks. It wouldn't really be like a good webinar if we didn't have like one or two little glitches, right? I do see a message on, it is Wednesday, that's right. And yes, you can serve targeted populations such as persons with disabilities and veterans. Eligible participants must be part of the targeted populations and must reside or receive services in a, it can be either or. Sorry, I did say either or, that's right.
Okay, great. And we got quite a few questions about the recording, and Sarah posted in the chat that both the recording and the PowerPoint PDF will be available on Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours.
And then I'm going to just on the 250 employees, the employer with 250 or less, just to reiterate that if you are using a small business that has 250 employees or less, you can serve any industry. So that is an exception.
Okay, do you want to take more questions or do you want to move on to something else?
Let's take a couple of more and then we can move on to the budget.
Okay, awesome.
Or the GATA, sorry.
Yep. Who determines what qualifies as an industry recognized certificate or credential?
That should be part of your application. So you should be working with your training program should know if it's an industry recognized credential or program.
Okay. Can subgrantees be for profit?
That is a Tamika question.
I am not seeing anything that states that they cannot. So I believe that they can, but we will post that question as well in the FAQ link.
Okay. In partnerships, such as an industry association, are you looking for a specific prime applicant, or is it more about capacity to manage the grant?
It's the capacity to manage the grant.
Okay. Regarding the scoring rubric, are there costs / participant or other efficiency targets?
Other than what's required in the performance metrics and the goals, no. And Tammy's going to tell me if I answered that incorrectly. But I don't think so, no.
Can participants be co-enrolled in other workforce development programs if the services provided are not duplicated?
Yes.
Food service / restaurant industry is not a category. Someone is wondering about that. It was most hard hit during COVID.
I think that's not exactly what it's called, but that is one of the industries. It's food services, accommodation and food services, and retail trade, which is not necessarily food service, but that is one of the other industries.
Let's see here. Okay, if the grant is looking at short-term credentials and getting individuals into industry quickly to help fill positions in industries impacted by COVID, but we are looking at creating and designing curriculum. This can take many months. Will this be viewed negatively on application since it is not an immediate impact?
The grants are for 2 years, so in my mind, you'd have to demonstrate the impact that you're going to have with designing curriculum and where your customers would be at the end of those 2 years. So I think the short answer is no, if you have to design curriculum, but you definitely have to demonstrate how you're going to impact customers in that community. And, because the real point of it is to get folks upskilled, reskilled, and placed into self-sustaining wages.
Can you serve a targeted population such as persons with disabilities and veterans?
Yes, you can.
If we have more than one location, do we need applications for each?
No, I think you can just address that in your application.
Do you anticipate that there will be additional funding opportunities under JTED in the spring of 2022 under the same requirements?
There will be many of the same requirements. I don't want to say all of the same requirements. Is one of the things that we're going to be doing over the course of the next few months is really looking at the program model and thinking about how to build capacity of providers, smaller providers that don't traditionally apply for state and federal funds. So we're looking at how we can build that capacity, and then two, based on how we can build that capacity, what has to change in the funding opportunity requirements.
Okay, I think we just have 2 more questions, then we're all caught up.
Okay.
Okay. Are we still eligible to apply if hiring new staff would be part of the application and required to implement the program?
We don't have anything that says you can't, but I do think that speaks to sustainability. And if you hire someone now, how would you keep that person after the grant ends?
It is anticipated, this is in quotes, it is anticipated that through this NOFO, up to 1,200 individuals from the target population may be served. Is this per grantee?
Oh, no. No.
Okay. And then there's a question that I think Tamika will be answering in just a moment here. Are you using the GATA portal for applications?
Yes, Tamika will be. That's a perfect question to kick it off to Tamika then.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lisa. So for this next part of the presentation, we are going to have an overview on grant submission requirements under GATA. Next slide, please, Molly. So throughout your grant application process, these are the typical grant award documents that you'll utilize and or receive. So you have your NOFO, which has been published for JTED, and Lisa just did an overview, but you also have your uniform application for state grant assistance, the uniform budget template that we'll talk about later in the presentation, and then also your notice of state award. Next slide. So there are 3 phases when you think about the grant life cycle. You have your pre-award, your award, and your post-award phases that grantees will go through when they receive a grant state award. This presentation will focus heavily on the pre-requirements, but as you navigate through the grant process, and I know we have plenty of veterans that have received state awards, these are the 3 phases that a grantee will go through. Next slide. So GATA is a landmark legislation that will increase accountability and transparency in the use of grant funds. It will also reduce the administrative burden on both state agencies and grantees. Under GATA, we have developed and adopted some things that we'll talk about, like risk assessments that are uniform across all state award agencies to kind of reduce some of those different activities that we've had to go through in the past. These are accomplished through the adoption of the federal grant guidance and regulations. Most of you may know that as uniform guidance or uniform requirements as outlined in 2 CFR Part 200, which we'll also go through towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So before a grant award is executed, grantees will have to go through some pre-award requirements. So there's registration, there's a pre-qualification process, risk assessments, both fiscal and programmatic. And then as Lisa mentioned earlier, as also when you review the NOFO for JTED, any mandatory disclosures or conflict of interest documents that are associated with your grant that you're applying for. These are your typical requirements and processes that grantees will go through. Next slide. So before grantees go through the pre-qualification process, you should go to grants.illinois.gov. Within that website, there is a grantee links tab, and that will navigate you through the requirements. And then also, this is your way to gain entry point into the GATA portal. So when you click on that grantee links tab, you will see the following items like the authentication, registration, that pre-qualification and risk assessment tabs. And then also some of the most common questions I get when grantees do access that grantee links tab is the authentication process. And that process is whomever is the representative for the organization that will be completed the pre-requirement documentations, sign up for the GATA portal. That just allows us to verify that relationship between that individual and that organization. And then also grantees will have to go through the indirect cost rate system, also known as CARS. So each grantee and entity must have an indirect cost rate option selected for their grant as part of their grant process. And we'll get into that as well. Next slide, please. So in order to navigate through the pre-qualification process and actually make your way through that process, these are the items that grantees must be able to verify. So you have to have a valid DUNS number. Your SAM.gov account should be accurate and updated, be within good standing of the Secretary of State, ensure that you are not on any sanction list or stop payment list. As you are going through the GATA portal and you are verifying this information and uploading information, the information is reviewed on a nightly basis. So as that information is verified, grantees will get an email that's saying that those items have been qualified. And if there's any additional information in the same circumstance, an email will be sent to that entity, just stating that those items have not been qualified, and also give content on what needs to be updated. Next slide, please. And again, as I just stated, you will receive that qualified status, but if your items are not current, like your DUNS number or that SAM cage code hasn't been updated in your SAM.gov account, things of that nature, you will get email submitted stating that. Next slide, please. So risk assessments. The fiscal risk assessment, or the ICQ, the internal control questionnaire, is one of those automated processes. And the ICQ is completed on an annual basis by the grantee, but it is one of those questionnaires that is completed on an entity-wide level. So you only need to complete one ICQ, and that will be, each state award agency will have access to that ICQ. So that's one of those examples when we talked about reducing those administrative tasks. So if you've already completed an ICQ because you have a current state award, that information will be utilized moving forward when going through other grant funding opportunities. But the programmatic risk assessments, those are unique to each NOFO. So you may have to complete more than one programmatic risk assessments, but based on the outcome of both of those risk assessments, that will determine if any additional special conditions may be applied to the grantee with their state grant award. If that is the case, the grantee will be notified, and then those special conditions will be included in your state award. Next slide, please. So indirect cost system. So as stated earlier, all grantees must select the indirect cost rate option. So there are several options that grantees can utilize. If you already have a current federal grant award and you have an approved negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, you can utilize that agreement for your state award as well. You may also negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois by submitting the proper documentation through the CARS system. If you do not have a current federal negotiated indirect cost rate and you do not want to negotiate a rate with the state of Illinois, you can use what's called the federal 10% de minimis rate. And that is a rate of the modified total direct cost. And by modified total direct cost, when utilizing the 10% de minimis rate, there is a cost pool that certain direct cost line items are utilized to compute your 10% de minimis rate. Not all budgeted direct cost line items are utilized when determining that, but if you do elect the 10% de minimis rate, there are steps that you will be notified of to compute that. But also entities have the option to decline any indirect cost rate if grantees are not going to charge or elect to not have any indirect cost rate expenditures reimbursed to them, then declining any of the indirect cost rate is an option as well. I will say making that entry that will stay within the system until the grantee makes an updated rate election. Next slide, please. So if you are not familiar with the indirect cost rate proposals and elections, again, navigating through that grants.illinois.gov website and going under that grantee links tab will provide FAQs, training modules, forms and templates, especially if you're going through that 10% de minimis. There is a template that you can utilize to help you compute that rate and what your modified total cost rate will look like. If you currently do not have a rate selected, new grantees must make an election within the CARS system 3 months after the effective date of the state award. And moving forward, this is an annual submission that all grantees must go through. So you must verify your election rate on an annual basis. Next slide, please. So as we've talked about earlier, the grant state. Molly, can we take that question right now before we move on about indirect cost rate?
Yeah, totally. So the question is the indirect cost rate. This is to be negotiated after grant award, not prior to submission. If not prior to submission, what should be included in the grant request budget? An estimated goal or just the 10% de minimis?
So if you are going to go after, if you currently do not have a negotiated indirect cost rate and you want to go after one with the state of Illinois, you can make that election on your application and also on your budget template, and utilize there on your budget template. There is a outline of how you are going to compute it. So at the time of your budget, it may be an estimated cost, but you do want to elect the indirect cost rate that you are going to utilize for the grant. So if you know that you're going to go after a negotiated rate, do not select the 10% de minimis, select the negotiated state election rate that you're going to go after and utilize the template to compute that information. And during the review process, if we need to go back, for instance, if you utilize budgeted line items that are not allowed, or if your items are not computed accurately, or if there's any errors, that will be communicated back to the grantee to adjust. But please utilize the rate that you will use for the application. Okay. Can you go back to the previous slide, Molly? Thank you. When you're looking at your state, the documentations that would be utilized, we talked about that Uniform State Grant Assistance application. And this is the application. It's a 4-sheet application, and there are different components and sections. So you have your agency information, and that's when you would list the funding opportunity information. You would list the agency information, key contact information. There's also sections where you have to list the areas that are going to be affected within your project. So you can list cities, you can list zip codes, you can list the counties as well. And then also for certification, the person that is signing off on the form must sign the form. And then there is a certification disclosure listed on the application that just states that the information presented is true and accurate. So that application will be part of your documentation for submitting your full proposal for your funding request. Next slide, please. So one of the important points is utilizing your uniform budget template. With your uniform budget template, this is where you have the opportunity to not only list out your budgeted items for your grant, but also provide a detailed narrative and itemized scope of your budgeted items. So we utilized a uniform budget template that's modeled for those of you who know SF 524. And within your budget template, there are 3 sections. There's section A, section B, and section C. Section A of your uniform budget template, that allows you to summarize all of your line items and all of your expenditures. And then also, that also allows you to, on your funding application, when you list the required funding, you will also list that in your summary on the budget template as well. Section B, as I referenced earlier, when discussing if you're utilizing funds that are outside of your state funding request, that is the section that you will input that information. If you're using any match funds, if you're utilizing any other funding resources, Section B outlines the steps into summarizing those funding streams. And then Section C of the budget template is where you will list your budgeted line items for the particular grant and also provide a detailed narrative. When thinking about your budget, please ensure that you have these 3 points in mind. All costs and expenditure must be allowable, reasonable, and allocable. And we'll talk more in depth about those. But definitely your application and your budget template and your proposal should all outline. Next slide, please. So costs, if you're not familiar with uniform guidance, I will recommend that you reference 2 CFR 200.403. And this talks about the allowable costs under uniform guidance. So your costs must be necessary and reasonable and allocable to your grant. So necessary in providing, those costs must be necessary to carry out your grant plan. The cost and the items must be reasonable in nature. And then you must be able to allocate them within your approved budgeted line items. If you have shared costs such as rent or utilities, you must be able to allocate those items throughout your other different funding streams as well. These costs must be consistent with your current policies that you have within your organization or entity. We don't want to have costs that are not consistent with the grant or not reasonable, or maybe the cost is driven up because of this being a state award. So definitely familiarize yourself with this guidance to ensure that you're properly budgeting for your grant award. Next slide, please. So as costs relate to JTED, not only should the costs be aligned with uniform guidance, but the costs must also be aligned with, because these are ARPA funds. So definitely as you're going through the NOFO, you're going through your budget templates, please reference the guidance that is giving for your budgeted line items. But some of the approved costs as outlined in this budget, you can budget for program participant wages. You can budget for the coordination of eligible training providers. So just be sure that the budgeted line items are identified in your budget template. And if there are any line items that are not allowable for your grant, when you do reference your budget template, you will see that those line items are grayed out. So any of the line items that are grayed out cannot be utilized for your particular grant proposal. Next slide, please. So again, to get a more in-depth overview on what are the guidelines for reasonable cost, please reference 2 CFR 200.404. Again, the cost must be reasonable in nature and amount. So when you're thinking about your expenditures and you're thinking about how you're obtaining them, so one of the things that we think of is arm's length bargaining, which the relationship between the entity and the vendor. So ensuring that there are no conflict of interest, ensuring that the costs are consistent with the cost that is throughout your organization. So if you utilize a contractor that you were using for another program, that still fits the criteria for your current grant award that you're going after. And typically that contract charges you $23 an hour for the work. And if that scope of work is similar to the current grant that you're applying for, we will look to see that that contracted amount is similar. So the cost is still reasonable. There's no difference due to the contractor now being placed on this grant award. So definitely ensure that as you're budgeting, as you're thinking about those expenditures, that they still are reasonable and necessary to carry out your grant awards. And understanding and becoming familiar with this guidance will be helpful during your budgeting process. Next slide, please. So again, more in-depth overview on your costs being allocable. You can find this at 2 CFR 200.405. Again, any costs that are charged to the grant should be able to be allocated to your budgeted approved grant line items. So you should not have any expenditures that are outside of your cost allocation plan. And this also goes to your indirect costs. So depending upon your indirect cost rate and how much was approved for your indirect costs, you should be able to expense those expenditures to that line item within the approved amount. So again, as you're looking at your cost allocation plan, as you're looking at your budgeted line items, ensure that each budget expense can be allocated to your grants. Next slide, please. So typically there are two different categories when you're thinking of the type of costs. So you have your direct costs, which is usually your direct activity to carry out your grant award. So you have your personnel that is associated with the grant. You have the materials, you have your contractors or your subrecipients, those direct expenditures that will carry out the activities that are part of your scope, part of your work plan. But you also have indirect costs. So these are costs that definitely impact your grant, are definitely needed to carry out your work for your grant, but are not necessarily having direct impact or direct communication with your participants. So this can be your fiscal team. So you have your fiscal team that is overseeing your budgets. They are paying your contractors, paying your vendors, overseeing payroll, things of that nature. While they may not have direct communication or direct hands-on with your grant project, they are impacting your grant indirectly in an indirect format. So definitely, as you look at your direct costs and look at your indirect costs, these are the definitions that will help you categorize what's the direct and what's the indirect cost. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, when talking about
Tamika, did we lose you for a sec? It looks like maybe Tamika froze for a second, so we'll just hold on here for a minute or two and see if she pops back in.
Hey, while we're waiting, if there's non-budget related questions, I'm happy to answer those while we're waiting for Tamika. And then I also just want to remind folks about the TA session. So Molly, are there some programmatic related questions that I can answer?
There is one I see here. If our main headquarters is in Cincinnati, but we are leveraging the funds for Lake County, Illinois, can we use previous outcomes for the entire organization?
That's a good question, and let us discuss that internally, and we will post that on the FAQ. And while I mention that, do want to let everyone know that the FAQs will be posted either by the close of business today or tomorrow, especially for the questions that we had come up today. We'll include those that we answered as well as the ones that we have to get back to you on. So, and also while we're waiting for Tamika, just want to remind everyone that we do have additional technical assistance sessions on the horizon. One is this afternoon with Josh Coons, and at 12:30 he will be going over preparing the budget and sustainability. So he'll be taking you step by step on how to complete your budget. So certainly please avail yourself of that one if it can fit in your schedule. And then next week on deck, there is a flyer that has all of the sessions on it with registration links. Next week we have career pathways, work-based learning, business engagement, workers' rights, and then a session on, equity and employment. So did we get Tamika back?
I'm back. Sorry about that.
No worries, no worries. And yes, the TA sessions will be recorded, all of them, and they'll be accessible at least, within 24 hours of when it has happened. And that's at the longest. So I don't want to suggest, because we're going to try to get them up as soon as possible, but definitely after each session occurs, we'll get it posted as soon as we can. So anyway, okay, Tamika, thanks. Sorry
about that. I lost connection for a couple minutes. We're back to your budget template outline. So I was talking about that indirect cost rate information, and I know we've seen that in a few slides. But again, that election must also be reflected on your uniform budget template. And to also reiterate, you are utilizing the selection that you will use for the grant. And section B, as talked about earlier, that's when you will be able to document your match. So any additional cash or additional revenue outside of your state funding request, any in-kind or additional leverage, that is the section that you will summarize those funding resources. And again, as we talked about with the application process, again, whomever's the executive director or CEO, along with the CFO or fiscal person, will need to certify and sign off on your uniform budget template. And depending on the background of the subrecipients that you're utilizing, there is this FATA data collection. And based on that, there may be additional information that we have to enter in based on your subrecipient. If you look at that section on that worksheet, and look at the criteria, that would guide you to if you need to enter in any additional information. And again, as discussed with section C, so in section C, as you're navigating through your budget template and you're looking at those budgeted line items for your grant, you will see two sections. So like, for instance, if the first tab is personnel, at the top, that is where you will input all the personnel associated with the grant award, annual salary, and do an itemized breakdown. What percentage of that salary will be allocated to this grant? And then you will also have a box to input your budget narrative. And then also below, if you're using any non-state funding, that is the opportunity to provide detailed information, because in section B, That's just a summary. So in section C, you'll have that same outline. You will see personnel, you will list the information, you would enter in the itemized information, and then provide another detailed narrative on that non-state funding that would be utilized for that budgeted line item. So you will see that throughout each of those sections. And again, if any of those sections are grayed out, you are not able to utilize that budget line item for that particular grant award. Next slide, please. So this again just gives additional information on that section A. Again, this includes funding that's going to be provided by the state award agency. Utilize your budget line item definitions. Also, any grayed out items, those cannot be utilized. And then there is will be space for that budget narrative. Next slide, please. So after you go through the pre-qualification process, you've submitted your application, you've completed your budget template, and you have received a grant agreement, you're going to receive a document that is full with a lot of information. And I would just reiterate that please go through your grant award agreements very thoroughly, because it's going to talk about payment. It's going to give you the scope of grant activities, the purpose of the grants, allowable costs, required certifications, the requirements about lobbying, things of that nature. Next slide, please. And then also your audit requirements, your financial reporting requirements, performance, conflict of interest guidelines. A slew of information is going to be in that grant agreement. So grantees do need to go through that very thoroughly, just to ensure that you remain within compliance of all the articles that's listed in the grant agreement, and just so that you are aware as well. Next slide, please. So also, once you go through the articles, in the back of your grant agreement is where you're going to find your exhibits. So your exhibits are going to give you an overview of your project description. It's going to talk about the deliverables of the grant that needs to be carried out. It will outline how the payment is to be received, and also contact information, performance measures, standards, and any specific conditions. But definitely the first three exhibits are very important, just so you understand your deliverables and you're meeting those deadlines. But also payment. There are a variety of different ways that grantees receive payments from their grant award. So understanding that process, and then also your reporting requirements. How often do you have to submit your financial report, your performance report, things of that nature. So those exhibits will be detailed to your specific grant award. Next slide, please. And then also, if there's any specific terms that are associated with the grant, you may see some specific grantor terms or project terms, but that is definitely unique to each grant agreement or grant award. So depending on the deliverables or the terms of the grant, there may be additional specific terms that are associated with that grant agreement. Next slide. So before I talk about the budget question context, I know that there are questions about submission of your application. And as outlined on the NOFO specifically for JTED, they are using Smartsheet for grantees to upload and submit their application. So that is outlined in the NOFO. As well. So they are not utilizing the GATA portal, but we are using the GATA portal to go through those pre-qualification processes. So if you need to update your DUNS number, if you're going through the process of getting your sam.gov account updated or created, if you haven't submitted your documentation to ensure that you're within good standing with the Secretary of State, we are in your ICQ questionnaire. All that is done through the GATA portal, but we are utilizing Smartsheet to upload and submit your applications, which is due by 5 p.m. on October 29th. I don't believe, sorry, Molly, I'm looking at the questions around Smartsheet.
Yeah.
I don't believe the link has been made live yet, but I do know that will probably happen in the near future. But we can also add that to the FAQ as well when it's made available.
It looks like someone asked, does in-kind need a value attached or only the narrative descriptor?
In-kind will need a value attached to it. So again, on section B of your budget template, if you're using in-kind, you will summarize the total of that in-kind. But when you are in section C of your budget template and you are providing the narrative for that non-state funding, that's when you'll provide the description of that in-kind, but it needs to be itemized and there needs to be a value attached to which budget line item that in-kind value will be tied to and how that, what was the methodology for arriving at that in-kind value as well. Any other questions?
It looks like there was a question, does the grant allow for the purchase of equipment?
There is an itemized, give me 1 second. So equipment is allowable in the context of buying tools, books, like occupational gear and equipment, supplies needed for education. So within your scope of work, you would have to provide a detailed explanation of what that equipment will be. But in terms of tools or equipment that is provided for the participant to gain training or go through their courses, in that context, yes.
There was another question, can facility usage and costs be considered in kind if you do not seek reimbursement?
That's a good question. Typically, you can utilize facilities. So if your program is being housed in a facility and you are not going to charge rent or utilities against the grant, you can utilize that as an in-kind for the grant. But again, within your section C of your budget template, you will have to kind of describe that value and how you arrived at it. So if you're kind of looking at the amount of space that maybe the personnel is utilizing to carry out that grant. So you may do, square footage or something like that. But you can use that as in kind. You would just have to be specific on the value and how you arrived at that value and associated with your budget as well.
So there was a question, having never used a smart sheet before, I'm wondering if all these items have to be uploaded both there and GATA.
So the items that will need to be submitted through Smartsheet would be the items listed. So you have your uniform application. There's a conflict of interest disclosure, mandatory disclosure, your program summary, uniform budget. All those items that, as they're listed in the NOFO, will have to be uploaded and submitted to Smartsheet. But talking to those pre-requirements, like for, in your certificate for good standing and Secretary of State, things of that nature, those will go through the GATA portal. But your complete application as described in the NOFO, all those documents need to be submitted and uploaded through Smartsheet.
It looks like we are caught up on the questions regarding the budget. Do we have Lisa and Tamika? Is there anything else that we want to cover today? And right as I said that, another question popped in. So hold that thought for just a second. So the GATA pre-qualification portion should be done before application or confirmed after?
So the pre-GATA qualification process should be started, I would say, now. And the process continues as you are submitting your application and going through the process. So it can happen at the same time, but I would start on your pre-qualification process right now if you are intending on going after your grant award. That process should start now. So because at the end of the process, we can't execute a grant award until all of those pre-qualifications and everything in the GATA portal has been verified and deemed qualified.
Okay, and then here. What about equipment for training programs such as welders or CNC equipment to train participants?
So if the equipment is in relation to a training program that is needed for the participants, so if it's equipment or cost-related items that's related to enrollment or completion of education or training, those are allowable costs.
Okay. Are additional items allowable via an appendix section to the Smartsheet?
That I will have to get clarification on. And I'll add that one to the FAQ. I don't want to misspeak again. I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
At this time.
And we just have one more question. Clarifying on equipment cost, the cost can be used for direct student support, but not for equipment in regards to program expansion.
Can you repeat that question again?
Sure. So clarifying on equipment costs, the cost could be used for direct student support, but not for expansion but not for equipment in regards to program expansion.
I guess I would need to understand the context of program expansion.
There was another question here that popped up. Doesn't the equipment category apply only to items costing $5,000 or more, and the rest put under supplies?
Typically under uniform guidance, yeah, anything 5,000 or more is considered equipment. But as you look at your budgeted line items and definitions associated with this grant, you will see the word equipment utilized. But if you are requesting any equipment 5,000 or more, you will need approval for that. But typically, yes, under uniform guidance, anything over 5,000 is categorized as equipment, and the other items are categorized as supplies.
And then we did get some clarification on the question we just had, which, to repeat that question, regarding equipment cost. The cost could be used for direct student support, but not for equipment in regards to program expansion. And the clarification was, if we are focusing on manufacturing, can it be used for equipment in a manufacturing program?
Yes, I would repeat that if the equipment is related to the training or to be completed for the training or coursework, yes, that is an allowable cost.
Okay, regarding equipment examples, for construction trades, if I need a circular saw, can it be covered? If I need a laptop for the user to access online courses, could that be covered?
Yes.
Okay. Is equipment allowable for remote training expenses, for example, video conferencing or classroom smartboards?
Yes, if the courses or training are in a remote format, any expenses involved with ensuring that the participant can participate in those remote training courses, then those expenses are allowable.
Do we need to get approval for equipment over $5,000 prior to submission of the grant or after?
If you believe that you are going to need equipment over 5,000, please provide that narrative in your budget. When it is time to execute on that expenditure, there is a form within the department that does need to be filled out and signed up on before the expenditure, before that transaction can be executed.
Okay. Well, we're all caught up with questions. So Lisa or Tamika, do you have anything else to add?
I would just like to add, if you have any additional budget questions or questions for our newer grantees navigating the GATA portal, please reach out to myself and/or John Barr. I know this presentation was a high-level overview of going through those pre-requirements that are necessary. So definitely, if any questions come about after this presentation, here's our contact information. So definitely reach out and we'll support you on navigating through those requirements.
Awesome. And I also posted again the link to where the recording and the PDF of these presentations will be posted on WorkNet within 48 hours. So that is in the chat box. And like Lisa and Tamika have both mentioned, there'll be FAQs as well. So with that, thanks everyone for joining today. Make sure to check back on that website that I just posted for additional resources and look for those additional TA sessions that Lisa mentioned earlier as well. All right, I hope everyone has a good day. Lisa, did you want to add something before we wrap it up?
Nope, you covered it well. I just want to again thank everyone so much for participating and hope this information was helpful to you. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks. And I will stay on for one more moment in case anyone wants to copy links out of the chat box. So I'll keep this open for a minute or two so you can do that.
Great. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.